Hi, Motep. How are you? The other day I was watching a very enjoyable animation, The Prince of Egypt. And for those who have already seen it, you probably remember that slavery was a common thing in ancient Egypt. But what did Papi Mystique think of the movie?
18 out of 20 for the graphics, 17 out of 20 for the story, 2 out of 20 for historical accuracy.
Papi Mystique. Without wanting to tell us that the perspective of Egyptologists on slavery doesn't match the historical background of the Prince of Egypt. Here's a great opportunity to dive back into the fascinating era of ancient Egypt. Let's begin by defining slavery. What does our friend Larousse say? Hold on, because this isn't a simple definition. Larousse tells us that slavery is the fact a social group is subjected to a system that strips their freedom, forcing them to perform grueling economic tasks in exchange for only basic necessities like housing and food. According to Larousse, a slave is a non-free person viewed as an economic instrument that can be bought or sold, and who is under the dependence of a master. In other words, treating a person as an object rather than a human being. Being reduced to mere tools and given only enough to stay alive for that purpose is complete and clear, albeit grim. In episode 2, which you can access by clicking on Imhotep, historians had established that the pyramids were built by earthly beings like us. This raises the question of whether these wonders were built by slave hordes, and more generally, if slavery existed in ancient Egypt. We will examine slavery in ancient Egypt more closely to understand what is known about it today. If a myth exists, we must identify its origin. In order to answer this question, it is necessary to analyze the groups of people who could become slaves during ancient Egypt. In other words, the populations over whom Pharaoh and his state had power. Let's begin by questioning if the Egyptian people ever experienced enslavement themselves. Next, we will identify whether foreigners who immigrated to Egypt were sometimes reduced to slavery, as shown in The Prince of Egypt. We will then examine common law prisoners and conclude with prisoners of war. Ancient Egypt had significant forced labor during the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms. The yearly forced labor mobilization involved Egypt's lower classes on the various state construction sites, from developing new fields to monumental building projects. Without detailing the political, social, and economic aspects of pharaonic Egypt, it's useful to remember that the land, as well as the right to work it, this is important, belonged either to the state, to the nobles, or to the temples. It's crucial to distinguish between buying rights to have someone work on land and buying a person, which would grant all rights over them. Ancient Egyptian documents show clear evidence of land purchases and the associated work rights, but none seem to indicate the purchase of people to this day. Misunderstandings about purchasing work rights led to early Egyptologists incorrectly believing one group was a slave class. The Merete, which I will dare to pronounce this way. Anyway, the work of Moreno Garcia, research director at the French National Center for Scientific Research, tells us that based on our current knowledge, their status was a temporary one of forced labor. Moreover, in ancient Egypt, almost all of the lower classes could be conscripted for state labor. The conscripts, often recruited from the most disadvantaged peasant class and therefore lacking any particular skills, would logically end up doing hard labor rather than skilled work, unlike the craftsmen who were assigned to tasks related to their skills. Another status that is often confused is that of people who are unable to repay their debt. These people had to establish a new agreement with their creditor by entering their service until the debt was repaid. The debt was occasionally transferable to the indebted person's descendants. This element can also suggest that this status becomes dangerously close to slavery. It's worth noting that the person was never objectified and had rights concerning their treatment. Conversely, their rights to their belongings were understandably restricted until their debt was settled. Thus, the debtor had rights related to the debt that he could sell or transfer. Thus, the person in question would end up serving a new debtor, but his rights did not go beyond that. Although not slavery in the strict sense, this status was certainly uncomfortable due to the numerous deprivations involved. In conclusion, there is no evidence of native Egyptians being enslaved during this period. Various statuses under different names were closely linked to the country's functioning, and whose work was not always based on goodwill. But they are nevertheless distinguished from slavery or the status of a slave, as you have understood. Okay, but then what about the Hebrews we see toiling in the Prince of Egypt, whom Moses kindly frees? Modern Egyptologists do not consider religious books as valid historical sources for ancient Egypt, because of the major inconsistencies between the discoveries made and what the stories tell. Unlike 19th century Egyptologists, they believe that the reality of the Semites was very different from what is shown, for example, in the Prince of Egypt or told in the book of Exodus. Christian de Rochneublecourt and Zayawas, among others, assert they were not slaves at all, and they had even less to do with the construction of the pyramids, for two reasons. First, the Hebrew population of Egypt, originally from Canaan, present-day Palestine, likely immigrated to ancient Egypt due to economic factors, such as food shortages. During the New Kingdom, which was more than a millennium after the construction of the pyramids. Secondly, there were no slaves at the pyramid construction sites. In fact, they were skilled workers, free laborers, or local people forced to work on the site through compulsory labor. So we are far from the image of a Semite dragging heavy blocks under the blows of an Egyptian torturer. However, they seem to experience some marginal discrimination in their daily lives, as unfortunately happens nowadays with immigrants who have a different religion and culture from the host country. However, this discrimination was not officially sanctioned. There were no laws or intent to enslave the Semites, nor more generally, foreign populations. To conclude, the perspective that history offers us today is that foreigners, in general, although they had a specific status under ancient Egyptian law, were ultimately free workers. Quite simply, in the case of a crime in ancient Egypt, the punishments were varied. One of them consisted of requisitioning the labor force of the convicted person. In other words, the guilty party would be sent to fill positions lacking volunteers, typically the mines or hard labor on construction sites. Due to their misdeeds, these people were in a state of captivity, forced into hard labor with only the bare essentials for survival. Nevertheless, they could not be bought or sold and still belong to themselves. It's a bit like a prisoner nowadays who ends up doing community service, but in a much tougher version. Prisoners of war were probably those whose status was closest to that of a slave. During successful military campaigns, Pharaoh's armies would capture enemy soldiers and bring them back as prisoners of war among their spoils. But it was common for the women and children from cities that had resisted too much to be taken as spoils of war. Nevertheless, where there is a difference from what we mean by the term slave is that they had rights. They too were not considered objects, even though they were the property of their master. They were given an Egyptian name for assimilation and had, for instance, the right to proper treatment. That is to say, among other things, enough food, clothing, housing, and even peace. They also had the right to file a petition or a complaint with a representative of Egyptian justice in case of abuse. However, these rights were often difficult to exercise in practice. This led, for example, to group complaints from prisoners of war working in the mines in order to make themselves heard. On the other hand, their status greatly restricted their individual freedoms and their condition was of a servile nature. They were mainly used as servants and household staff, or for hard labor, such as working in the mines. They were essentially quasi-slaves, with the distinction of having some important rights, and because they were legally considered human beings and not objects or mere economic instruments. By playing with words, we can reach this conclusion. If others want to discuss slaves, even in a euphemistic way, they wouldn't be entirely incorrect. To finish on that note, it's still useful to point out that slavery, as we've defined it, was imported into ancient Egypt during the periods of Persian occupation and the Greek dynasties. These latter are commonly considered as still being part of ancient Egypt. Depending on the reference points used, it definitively ends in 30 before Christ. after illuminating history for over 3 millennia. In conclusion, based on what we have just seen and the definitions, there was no slavery, nor even slaves in ancient Egypt, at least not quite, except during the late period and the reign of the Greek dynasties, during which there was no ambiguity. Historically, it's evident that a status existed which subjugated certain individuals. But talking about slavery is more ambiguous and would potentially concern only a very limited part of Egyptian society, the prisoners of war. So, the now classic question arises, where does this common idea come from? Who gave Egypt this image of massive slavery? On the scale of these grand monuments, there seem to be 3 main reasons. The first accounts would be from the Greeks, which many historians have relied on. The Greeks, including Herodotus, were also impressed by the ancient Egyptians' architectural achievements. They considered it absolutely impossible that the monuments they saw before their eyes could have been built by a free people and not by slaves. Then came the religious books, seeking to highlight the power of a god, a faith, or a people, such as the Book of Exodus. To mention just that one, Egyptian civilization was regularly inserted into their narrative to benefit from its prestige. We now know that these should logically be read with some distance and great caution in order to extract the relevant information for history. The final element results from the preceding 2. Early Egyptologists relied on Greek accounts and religious documents, which were often handled without proper caution. These elements then entered popular culture through these various channels, with the different forms of art doing the rest of the work. In conclusion, the ambiguous status of prisoners of war remains unresolved. The common perception of slavery in ancient Egypt is a myth based on the evidence presented. Except under foreign dynasties during the last days of ancient Egypt, from now on you'll watch the Prince of Egypt with a more discerning eye. But I do hope with the same enjoyment. Until next time.